Hi, and welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast. Today, I'd like to explain to you why our housing crisis is going to expose some of the flaws in the quick fix solutions our major political parties are telling us is going to solve the housing crisis. I was actually writing a blog about this, and I thought, hey, I've actually got to discuss it with you. Now, as a regular listener, you'd know I normally have guests on the show, but every now and then it's just me and you, and that's what this show is today, as I want to get out some thoughts about why our housing crisis is going to become a fierce political battle, and that could have major implications leading right up to the next election. Both the parties, the major parties, have come up with some ideas and they just don't cut it. So if you're interested in property as an investor, as a home buyer, I hope I'm going to give you some insights into what's ahead and what not to believe when the media tells you. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
I was spending some time thinking about this over the weekend, so I thought I'd just sit down and have a chat with you about how I see Australia's housing crisis becoming a fierce political battle that's going to have major implications over the next year leading up to the federal election. As I see it, a fierce battle is going to start being contested. It's going to intensify. I think it's going to define the next federal election as Labor, the Coalition and the Greens are all targeting a growing cohort of voters who believe they're going to be locked out of home ownership forever. Opposition leader Peter Dutton kicked off what I'd be calling his election campaign in his budget reply, and he had this populistic promise he's going to fix the housing crisis by cutting back on migrant numbers and cap foreign student visas. That's not a housing policy. It's just a cut in immigration. The problem is there's no quick fixes to the housing crisis, yet both the Coalition and Labor continue to chase short-term solutions, but ones that don't really address the real issues, and I'm going to go into those in a moment. You see, anything that's easy and popular won't work to solve housing affordability. Mr. Dutton's strategy of blaming immigration for housing woes offers appealing sound bites to the media. They love picking that up. He talked about restoring the dream, the great Australian dream of home ownership. However, this approach ignores the deeper structural problems in Australia's housing supply. I guess that's partly what I want to discuss with you today, to show you that there's no simple problems, but that also creates opportunities for those who know what's going on. You see, Dutton proposes to slash permanent migration from 185,000 to 140,000 people over the next 2 years, making that the lowest level in 2 decades. Then after that period, he says the numbers are going to gradually rise to 150,000 and then 160,000. Now, his argument was this would reduce demand and it's going to help meet Anthony Albanese's government's target. You remember that target of building 1.2 million homes over 2029. He says it's going to free up the need for 100,000 homes over the next 5 years. Of course, many industry experts are worrying that this policy is going to, significantly decreasing immigration would only worsen the existing shortfall of builders and tradies, and it's going to potentially backfire. Of course, there are still shortages in all sorts of other industries as well. It's been suggested there's actually a shortfall of 600,000 builders and tradies at the moment. Now, I know in the budget, the Labor government said they're going to increase tradies, but I think they said something like 20,000, and that's going to take a number of years for them to work their way through tech. And as I said, there's skills shortages in lots of areas, so decreasing immigration is only going to make that worse. Look, as I said, immigration won't stop the strong demand from home buyers. Sure, it may lessen the demand for our rental markets, for accommodation for renters, because immigrants tend to rent for the first few years until they work out where they are, where they want to live, where their jobs are in Australia. But as for housing demand, there are still a number of substantial demographic changes that I'm going to explain in a moment, plus the strong population growth that's already there, the pent-up demand that I believe is going to keep house prices high. Now, interestingly, a chart I just saw a couple of days ago from Sarah Hunter, the chief economist at the Reserve Bank, showed that Australia's housing supply is very low by international standards. According to the OECD, Australia's levels of housing there were 420 houses per 1,000 people in Australia. And this lags behind many, many other countries where there were lots more houses. The OECD average was much higher than that. And so the bottom line is we just don't have enough houses for the number of people already here. Of course, Dutton also planned to stop foreign investors and temporary residents from purchasing established properties. He said that was going to be for the next 2 years. Now, we know that in general, foreign investors and people who are not permanent residents can't easily buy established properties. There's lots of hoops to go through. So in my mind, this populist answer isn't really going to make any difference at all. We're talking about a few thousand purchases a year. The spike in new arrivals to Australia really came, this huge population growth, from a rebound in foreign student numbers after the pandemic paused all migration. Remember, before the pandemic, net Australian migration was around 240,000 people a year, and this number plummeted during the pandemic, actually even going into negative as Australia experienced net emigration going out. By 2022, the numbers had normalised, and then the surge of 550,000 people came in our catch-up mode. But a lot of them were students, making up for those that had gone back home, and that's not going to continue there. And now, each year, students are going to leave as they finish their courses as well. So the figure of 500,000 or more migrants was unusually high, and it's correcting itself. Look, over the pandemic period and subsequent recovery, Australia's population reached roughly the same level as it would have without interruption. Interestingly, we caught up again. But Dutton's restrictions might have limited impact because more than half the permanent immigrants applying for already in Australia on temporary visas, meaning they're already part of the housing demand and the housing problem. And also the number of foreign buyers buying property here, as I said, is really minimal due to existing regulation. So it sounds very good, and the media picks that up without really understanding what's going on. Okay, well, what about capping international students? Is that a good idea? That was proposed by Peter Dutton, but in my mind, that would have significant consequences for Australia's tertiary education sector. Remember, it's one of our big exports. Australia's economy is doing well, in some ways a little bit too well for the Reserve Bank, and Australia's economy is likely to continue doing well, underpinning our housing markets and just the wealth of the nation. There are really four big ways. We don't manufacture anymore. So how do we make money? Four big ways Australia makes money. We dig things out of the ground and sell them overseas. You know, our mining industry. We grow things in the ground and sell them overseas. Our food industry, including wine sectors, including lobsters and oysters and those other things as well. International education is another huge export industry where a lot of money comes in from overseas. And remember, these students who come here were also filling those jobs that, remember during COVID, there were signs up in all the cafes, baristas wanted, wait staff wanted. So they're filling those jobs. But also when they come here, they grease the wheels of industry. They rent our accommodation. They still buy themselves equipment and phones and all sorts of things. So the education system is a very important part of our economy, and Peter Dutton's trying to shackle it. I said there are four things. The fourth big thing that the Australian economy, or that drives the Australian economy, is, of course, tourism as well. But over the last years, government funding's been withdrawn, so our universities have turned to fee-paying foreign students to remain economically viable, to remain the same size, and to employ the same number of academics. In my mind, if the number of foreign students is reduced, either the government's going to have to keep funding our universities, increase that, and I can't see that happening, they haven't got the money, or local students are going to have to pay more, and at the moment I can't see that happening either, or the size of our universities would have to shrink, meaning there'd be less education, fewer degrees, less research. no, Mr. Dutton, that's a silly thing to reduce international student numbers. They are at the moment renting property. Some of them are going to stay as permanent migrants, and that's great, but they're paying for their way in Australia, and they're helping take up the jobs that many Australians don't want to do. Okay, well, what about Labor's policies? Labor's approach focused on capping overseas student numbers as well to reduce immigration. Universities exceeding these caps must demonstrate they can provide housing for students. So all of a sudden they're saying, okay, well, we know we need more supply. Mr. University, it's your job to create that. However, this strategy merely shifts the supply shortage problem elsewhere, turning universities into builders or developers, facing the same local council approval challenges that others who want to provide student accommodation are doing. The policy also mines, as I said, Australia's fourth largest export industry, and apparently that's worth $49 billion annually. And I think that's going to, if they do cut student numbers significantly, destabilise an industry that's vital to our economy. Look, in my mind, both the Coalition and Labor's attempts to tinker with the housing demand through migration are misguided. Labor's recent budget, with its inflationary cost of living measures and spending on, competing against Chinese solar panels, is just another example of populist, short-sighted solutions. The political debate risks avoiding the tough decisions necessary to address the housing crisis, instead relying on crowd-pleasing but ineffective answers. The housing crisis, as you've heard on this podcast and on my regular videos with Dr. Andrew Wilson, has built up over many years, almost a decade now, when it was difficult for developers to build stock, but more importantly, it also was difficult, that made it harder, less attractive for private investors who provide 92% of the rental accommodation. They made it more difficult for investors, and that's tipped the scales in the favour of tenants, and I'm sure you've heard the statistics that investors are slowly selling up. Now, there's also other long-standing and persistent supply bottlenecks. Interestingly, recently, Reserve Bank's Assistant Governor of Economics, Sarah Hunter, described the situation we're currently experiencing as a perfect storm of constraints in the housing supply. Aside from the record levels of immigration, the other key driver of demand, interestingly, has been a reduction in the average household size, just due to demographics, our ageing population and smaller families having fewer kids, and the trend to needing more space in our homes and fewer shared houses. She was suggesting some of the major factors driving our housing markets. Interestingly, the average number of people living in each household trended lower over the years, from about 2.8 people in the middle of the 1980s to around 2.5 people per household now. Now, that doesn't sound like much of a change, but the Reserve Bank's economists suggested that if the average household size doesn't rise back to 2.8, and I can't see that happening, we'd need 1.2 million more dwellings to house our current population for the same number of people, because there's fewer of us in each household. If you think about it, that's more than sort of 10%, the 2.8 to 2.5 drop. So we've got more population, but fewer people in each house. The other interesting thing, of course, is how we want to live and where we want to live. The Reserve Bank, in this talk that Sarah Hunter gave, showed some interesting statistics of how many more people are working from home nowadays. Now, prior to the pandemic, there was around 30% of people, about 10 years ago, working from home some of the time. And over the last while, it's now closer to about 38%. I mean, during the pandemic, it got much higher than that, didn't it? But then we didn't have a choice. What that means is the sort of houses we're looking for has changed also. In other words, working from a kitchen table doesn't hack it anymore if you're doing it in the long term. You want to have a separate media Zoom room. And so that's one of the reasons why more people are looking for larger accommodation. The other big factor, of course, is that many millennials are now moving to household formation stage of their lives, and so living in an apartment isn't sufficient anymore. They're going to look for houses. Now, we know that over time, I've been around these property markets for, over 50 years now, and I've seen how the cycles move. Eventually, supply does respond to growing demand, but the speed and magnitude of that response varies from cycle to cycle and is determined by rental and house prices, underlying construction costs, and then the time to design and improve buildings. And as you've heard me say often, currently it's just not financially viable to build many new dwellings. The more expensive dwellings work out financially, but the average apartment and house doesn't. So in the meantime, house prices and rents are just going to have to adjust. Hey, there's only one way they're going to adjust. They're going to go up, aren't they? So the extent of this adjustment has, over the years as I've been following the cycles, differed from one cycle to the next and depends upon relative movements in supply and demand. At the moment, the very shortage of properties is creating skyrocketing rental increases. And in due course, we're going to see when interest rates peak and people feel that they're not going to go up anymore and foresee that interest rates are going to go down, there's going to be a increased demand for homes as well. What that really means to me is that currently there's a window of opportunity to get in before all those others get into the market. But really what's happened is at the moment we're just not building enough accommodation for what's required at the moment. But what happened was during the pandemic, government incentives for home building and renovation led to a spike in building costs. There was a shortage of labour and materials, and then state government and infrastructure projects put further strain on resources. And overall, this has pushed building costs up around 40%. And then the Reserve Bank's interest rates hiked to combat inflation after all this, led to many construction companies going bust. And therefore, it's very difficult to build new accommodation. Developers and builders are wary and only want to do it if they're sure that they're going to make a margin at the moment. And currently, buying established properties, well, you can actually buy them cheaper than replacement cost. But what's happened is there's really very little demand for new accommodation at the moment. But what's also impacting this long-standing council restrictions against medium-density housing, because we are going to need to build more medium-density housing. Of course, that just unfortunately makes it more expensive. Medium-density housing is a lot more expensive to build than one or two story properties. And of course, once you get even higher than that, the high-rise towers are even more expensive to build, and developers won't be able to start them, pull them out of the ground until end values go up a lot. There's a number of other factors driving our markets at the moment, and one of them is the lack of supply, making it harder for people to buy and rent. There's a shortage of housing stock, and the number of homes being offered for sale has fallen year after year. And similarly, the number of rental properties has been falling since 2020. And this has seen our vacancy rates around Australia fall, well, more or less below 1% in most locations, when around 2% is considered a balanced market. So when there are fewer properties for rent and long queues of people looking for those, landlords, not because they're greedy, but the market supply and demand is pushing up rentals. Of course, landlords are also wearing extra costs, and the rising rents don't make up for that. In other words, there's the rising mortgage costs, insurance costs, compliance costs, land tax in many states as well. So we're seeing significant rental growth, and in some parts of Australia, vacancy rates have dropped to almost 0.5%. And so, therefore, it's really hard at the moment for people to get into the housing market, young people, because, well, they've got to pay more rent, the cost of living has gone up, the cost of petrol's gone up, and the severe supply shortages meant that house prices and rents have more than doubled since the mid-2000s. Our population has just been growing so strongly, and when coupled with the changes in people's housing preferences, as I've already explained, it's just resulted in a worsening situation for renters and first-home buyers. Now, interestingly, I heard somebody say the other day, hey, there's no rental crisis. It doesn't affect a majority of Australia's population. If you think about it, half Australians who own a home don't even have a mortgage against it. And others who are paying off their mortgage, well, most of them are coping pretty well at the moment anyway. But there's no doubt that some people are suffering, and I don't like seeing an Australia where there are people who just can't find a home. But a growing share of household incomes are now going towards housing and housing services. Treasury officials say that for prospective home buyers, the proportion of income needed to service a new loan has jumped from an average of about 29% of their income to service a new home loan in 2020 to 46% of a household income to service a mortgage in 2023 last year. So no doubt it's hard for people to get into the housing market. Of course, unless they've got the help of the bank of mum and dad. We know more and more of that's happening. Unfortunately, that's also creating more haves and have-nots. In other words, the wealthy people are able to help their kids in the property market and others are not. So over the long term, there has been a decline in affordability in Australian housing, which in my mind means that more people are going to remain tenants. The government also needs to supply social housing. That's a different thing altogether. So the government has left normal housing for the third of Australians, the 7 or so million Australians who need or want to rent, to private rental providers, in general mums and dads. A little bit's now going to happen in the build-to-rent sector, but it's basically people like you and me who are providing accommodation for Australians who choose to rent, not necessarily because they're poor, but just because of the way they are, where they are in their lifestyle. But I believe it's the government's responsibility, obligation, to actually provide social housing. And apart from the low levels of general housing stock, the rates of construction of social housing, public and community housing, has been falling for decades. And that's a really bad situation. Social housing, it's rental housing fully or partly funded by the government, owned and managed by community organisations or the government. It includes public housing, state-owned housing, managed Indigenous housing, community housing, those sort of things. And the government says public housing completion and the share of social housing as a proportion of total stock has declined consistently over the last 3 decades. Since 1996, the level of social housing construction hasn't been enough to keep the pace of the sales and demolition of existing stock. So, boy, that's dropping a lot. So, what can the government do about it? Well, since winning the election in 2022, our current government has made nearly $26 billion in commitments to the housing problem, and in the budget it added another $6.2 billion in the way of new commitments. But basically what it was doing was propping up what it already had said it was going to do, which is, well, they say build 1.2 million dwellings, but we know that's not going to happen. They're not going to build any of them at all. So what they've done is given an extra $1 billion to the states for the housing support program. They've given $1.9 billion to increase the maximum rate of Commonwealth rent assistance. Now, that increases rents by 10% for those who need it over a 5-year period. But that's not enough. They've actually put money in at $88 million for 20,000 new fee-free TAFE places over 3 years to include pre-apprenticeship programs. Those apprentices won't come out for 3 years. I guess all I'm trying to say to you is that unfortunately there is no short-term answer to this. They're going to allow foreign investors, the government in the budget, to purchase established build-to-rent developments with lower foreign investment fees. They're going to give them other incentives to start building build-to-rent, but they're not going to come out of the ground for a long, long time. And so there's going to be winners and losers. One of the losers, if some of these things happen, is going to be the tertiary sector, like we said. And the losers are going to be first home buyers, despite a few new programs. The winners are going to be those who can afford. And we shouldn't have winners and losers, but this is not a competition. It's what's happening in the world. The winners are those who are going to own the right sort of investment properties in the right locations, because there's going to be a significant shortage of rental accommodation throughout Australia, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And there's going to eventually, as the cycle moves on, be new houses, new apartments, new townhouses being built, but the end cost of those, and therefore the end value of those, is going to be much higher, and that's going to push up the value of Australia's established properties. In fact, you can buy apartments in many parts of Australia significantly below replacement cost. So I guess my question to you is, are you thinking about getting into property this year, either as an investor or a home buyer? You've probably got a number of questions you're wondering. Is it the right time? What should you do? Maybe I should hold off. Maybe I should wait. I don't know what your personal situation is, but why not have a chat with the wealth strategists at Metropole to discuss your options? Remember, we're much more than another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. And we're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. So before we even talk about property, we actually help you formulate a plan to become the people you plan to become, because the property you eventually buy should be the physical manifestation of a whole lot of decisions you make, and make in the right order, so that it's part of a long-term plan, not an emotional, hey, I'm just going to buy because of FOMO, because I'm worried. So my question is, how long are you prepared to wait? You've seen the news. All the research houses have shown that the property markets turned in, beginning of 2023. That was quite some time ago. Now, there's no doubt that we're going to keep having all these things in the news and have economic and political and financial problems. On the other hand, strategic investors aren't worried about where interest rates are going to be in 3 months or 6 months. They're encouraged by where our housing markets are going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. And so if you think that the politicians are going to solve these problems, as I said, there's no easy answer. So if you're interested in getting in property investment or buying a new home before FOMO drives the herd back into the market later this year, early next year, go to metropole.com.au and have a chat with one of our wealth strategists. And as I said, we're much more than buyer's agents. Yes, we can help you buy a home, but we've actually got to help you set yourself up right to safely create intergenerational wealth.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
Today, I'd like to teach you the most important lesson you can teach your children about money. Now, you may not have children yet, you may not be planning to have children, or your children may have grown up, but I believe this lesson is so important, it'll be relevant for you as well. You see, we live in a world of consumption where people seek immediate gratification. We want the latest and greatest gadgets, and we want all those products as soon as they hit the shelves, don't we? Think about Apple and that ridiculously long line of people who queue up as soon as their iPhones are a year old. Now, when it comes to money management and becoming rich, though, patience and delayed gratification, the opposite of the quick consumption, that makes all the difference. Patient people are more likely to save their pennies rather than seek those easy and what tends to be expensive credit cards or those afterpay systems, because they're happy to wait for their new car or the big TV screen or the latest gadget. They don't seem to have it all yesterday. Now, one of the common rich habits that I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, and that's a theme in my book, Rich Habits, Poor Habits with Tom Corley, is that we've found amongst the most successful people, they all share the habit of the ability to delay gratification. Successful people seem to possess a higher patience and an aptitude to postpone their enjoyment so that they can get more later on. They've got an ability to work hard to accomplish a goal which isn't achieved for a long time. Now, learning to delay gratification rather than seeking immediate satisfaction is an essential part of success, and particularly when it comes to things like investing, business, and making money. Yet it's not easy to change those ingrained habits and the approach to life that you've been practicing since childhood. But once you're aware of the importance of the concept of delayed gratification, in my mind it's entirely doable to change those habits. So you start with small alterations to your thought patterns. Well, first of all, by acknowledging your habits, those habits you've got to want immediate gratification. Remember, if it comes too quickly, chances are you're going to lose it again just as easily. Now, please stick with me, because there's probably some people out there thinking, oh, you old fuddy-duddy, you don't understand all that. But I've been through it all before. By the way, Now that I am financially independent, now that I've got a cash machine for my property portfolios, I don't have to wait. I don't have to delay my gratification. I'm not being smart or vain, but I can choose to buy or do whatever I want. But that's because I've built an asset base and I'm at the point where I am now. And if you're not there yet, I want you to get there by learning this concept of delayed gratification, because all good things take time. As Warren Buffett wisely said, wealth is the transfer of money from the impatient to the patient. So if you're wondering what I'm on about, let me explain. The definition of delayed or deferred gratification is the ability to resist the temptation for an immediate reward and therefore wait for a later reward. Now, this later reward is usually much larger than the immediate one, and that's why it's worth waiting for. Research into the ability to delay gratification shows there are a number of other positive outcomes from this skill. It's been shown that you end up with more academic success, physical and psychological health, and social competence. Similarly, a person's ability to delay gratification relates to other skills such as patience, impulse and self-control, willpower, and they're all involved in self-regulatory behaviour. So if we think about the rich and successful people, one of their key rich habits is the ability to delay a small instant reward for a later but more generous one. But we need to remember that this skill isn't natural for most people. So if you're having difficulty with it, don't feel bad. Humans are wired for instant gratification. We love it. Now, while evolution made us that way long before money was around, unfortunately, the desire for instant gratification doesn't help us when we're trying to become wealthy. In fact, it hurts us. That's one of the reasons many high-income earners are not rich. I see this all the time, where people are earning more, but they're spending more, and they end up on a treadmill. They tend to spend more than they earn because they need to support a lifestyle that's got little or no enduring value, but seems to come with a high fixed cost to maintain. Typically, they spend things on, a bigger house, fancier cars, more impressive vacations. People, as they earn more and work up the rungs at work, they live a life of instant gratification, a life where they live in a peer group of other big spenders. So you've got to do what your mates do, don't you? And where you have to work harder and harder just to maintain the lifestyle that you no longer seem to have the time and energy to enjoy anymore because you're working so hard. Hey, isn't that what they call the rat race? Anyway, when it comes to the latest gadget or fad, as I said, most people have got no control. And this is made even worse in the technological world we live in today, where we've got access to instant money, real or otherwise. It's not just credit cards, it's now all these new afterpay systems. But too many people use their credit card for impulse purchases. In reality, they've got no way of repaying that money anytime soon. And unfortunately, this type of mindset can quickly lead to financial ruin. So it's time to be honest with yourself. Are you a slave to instant gratification? If so, I just want to go through a couple of strategies to help you break the cycle. And if not, then please keep listening anyway. Congratulations, well done. But maybe you can tell somebody else about this episode, because there are so many people out there who have this habit. But the first thing to do is actually recognize that you've got the problem. So let me be clear. Consumer debt's never okay. Using a credit card for impulse purchases or to take on unnecessary extra debt for non-appreciating assets such as cars, or worse still, a personal loan to go on a holiday, that's never a good idea. Too many people see the limit on their credit card as their money. It's not. When you take on consumer debt, it involves using dollars you're hopefully going to earn in the future for current expenses or splurges, and then paying the bank interest for the privilege of doing so. This means that bargain that you paid for today is likely to cost you much more over the long run because you're using credit to pay for it. One of the key differences between people with consumer debt and those without, everything else being equal, is that that person with no consumer debt has generally mastered the delayed gratification system that we're talking about, while the other person, the person with consumer debt, hasn't mastered delayed gratification. The ability to wait to buy something after you've saved for the item, rather than impulsively purchasing something as soon as you realise you want it. That's what I mean by delayed gratification. The ability to invest money today to have money when you retire later, that's delayed gratification. And that's why you need to learn money management first, because there's no use taking on a large debt to invest in property or to set up a business or whatever you're going to do unless you understand the concept of delayed gratification. So investing money today to have more money for the future is, as I said, delayed gratification. So the real question, I guess, is how do you learn delayed gratification? Like I said, it's not easy, but it can become a skill in your Rich Habit Toolkit if you follow a few simple tips. So my first suggestion is write down a list of the money goals, your goals, and put them somewhere where you can see them every day. I know this sounds like rah-rah stuff, but it does actually work, the visualization. An even better idea is to tell somebody about your money goals, perhaps a mentor, somebody who can help you remain accountable to them. The next step is every time you feel tempted to purchase something, consider whether you want it or you need it. Is it a want or a need? If it's a want, such as, a new suit or a new handbag, then why not delay for at least 24 hours before deciding whether to buy it? Most of that time, that 24-hour period is enough for you to see, hey, you don't really need it. For most expensive items, though, you probably should delay even longer than 24 hours. If you're buying another doodad online, how about putting it in your shopping cart, but don't click the checkout button. Instead, come back in 24 hours if you still need it. Okay, buy it. You'd be surprised how often that desire disappears. Now, there's a science behind delayed gratification. Let me explain. Many people I know believe that delayed gratification is one of the secrets to success, and I certainly believe it's one of them as well. You see, there's been numerous studies about delayed gratification over the years, psychological studies, and I thought I'd share just two of them with you to illustrate how it works. Now, a classic one that's often mentioned is the marshmallow study. Have you heard about it? In 1972, there was an experiment that tested children's ability to delay gratification. Now, in this experiment, a researcher offered a small child a choice. They could have one marshmallow now or two marshmallows if they could wait a mere 15 minutes. Now, the researcher left the child alone in the room with the one marshmallow on a tray in front of them. And the child was filmed with secret video cameras. Now, of course, most children couldn't wait, and they soon ate the marshmallow. However, about 30% of them were able to delay gratification, and they got a second marshmallow. Now, interestingly, in the follow-up studies, these same children were tested for up to 30 years. And guess what happened? The ones that could wait for that second marshmallow, the ones that were able to delay gratification, were more successful later in life in all areas of their life. They got higher test scores at school. They seemed to have fewer problems with drugs. They were more likely to go to university or college. They had lower body fat. And as adults, they had more money. Now, according to the researchers, the children in the experiment used a number of techniques to delay gratification and control themselves. You see, they watched the videos, and I've seen some of them. You may have seen them on YouTube as well. Some of the children just turned around so they couldn't see the tray of marshmallow in front of them. Others covered their eyes so they couldn't physically see the marshmallow. Some even kicked the desk or pulled their hair out to distract themselves. Others stroked the marshmallow as if it was a toy or a doll or something. And of course, these were all techniques to control their focus. Sure, they were childish techniques, but hey, they were children, and they worked. What was clear from this experiment was that 30% of children who were lucky enough to have developed delayed gratification from a young age did so much better in life. But many people think that adults can also develop self-control through practice. And that's, I guess, what I'm suggesting for you if at this point delayed gratification or lack of it is a problem for you. You see, with that self-control, you can become more successful. You can reach your goals. In other words, the series of experiments that I was talking about proved that the ability to delay gratification is critical to success. So if you want to be successful, you're going to have to learn that skill. If you think about it, you can see the impact on success of being able to delay gratification wherever you look. If you can delay gratification of watching television and get your homework done as a child, you're going to learn more. You're going to get better classes, better grades. If you delay gratification of buying sweets or chips at the store, you're going to eat healthier and you'll be healthier too. If you can delay gratification of finishing your workout early, put in a few more reps or do another lap or two, you're going to be stronger. You're going to be fitter. So the question we need to ask ourselves is this. Why did some children naturally have more self-control and were therefore destined for success? So more research was conducted into delayed gratification to find out this answer. Now, researchers at the University of Rochester decided to replicate the marshmallow experiment, but they actually made a special and important twist. This time they split the children into two groups. According to the study results, the first group of children were also exposed to an unreliable experience. They were let down. They were given a promise to bring bigger crayons or more stickers compared to the small selection they were originally given. But these promises didn't materialise. On the other hand, there was a second group of children that had reliable experiences given to them. They were promised better crayons or stickers and they were provided to them. Now, it doesn't take Einstein to work out what consequently happened to the marshmallow experience, does it? The first group, having experienced broken promises, well, they had no reason to trust researchers. They didn't think they're going to bring them a second marshmallow, so they quickly ate the first marshmallow that was in front of them. On the other hand, the second group, they'd experienced delayed gratification training because their promises were kept. So they learned that waiting was worth it because they'd previously received better crayons or better stickers. So they had the capability of waiting longer. On average, according to the results, they waited an average of 4 times longer than the first group. In other words, the researchers found that children's ability to delay gratification and display self-control wasn't really a predetermined trait, but it was impacted by their experiences and by their environment that surrounded them. Now, I guess that's no surprise if you've actually had a look at how we develop. So, in fact, the effects of environment worked for them, but almost instantaneously. Just a few minutes of reliable or unreliable experiences was enough to push the actions of each child into one direction or another. Now, I hope you're finding this useful, and I hope you can understand then the thinking and the psychology behind why maybe you aren't as good with delaying gratification and why you should consider doing it. So thank you for listening. I've got a couple more points I want to make to you about this, because over the decades, these marshmallow experiments have been very popular and they've been tried by lots of other psychologists, but they're only one piece of the delayed gratification puzzle. Human behaviour, and I guess life in general, it's much more complex than that, isn't it? So let's not pretend that one choice of a 4-year-old is going to determine the rest of their life or her life or his life or how rich or successful they're going to become. However, my observation is that studies do highlight a very important rich habit. Waiting for that second marshmallow or better crayons or better stickers isn't easy. In fact, for children it's particularly hard. But what we can learn from this is you need to find the ability to be disciplined and take action instead of becoming distracted and doing what's easy. Success in nearly every field requires you to ignore something easier, in other words, delaying gratification, in favour of doing something harder. But that's one of the themes that I go through in my mindset message in my podcast regularly, isn't it? So the lesson from all this is that we all can develop the rich habit of delayed gratification and accepting what good things in life there are for us as long as we wait for them. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?